Hazardous Waste Operations, RCRA. Scope of program. Plaas Incorporated, also known as the company, has established this emergency response program with regard to the following types of operations. A. Cleanup operations as required by government hazardous substance regulations regarding uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. B. Cleanup activities and operations at waste sites regulated by the Resource Conservation Recovery Act of 1976, or RCRA. C. Cleanup operations voluntarily performed at sites recognized by government as being uncontrolled. D. Hazardous waste operations at storage, treatment, and disposal government-regulated facilities. E. Operations when responding to emergencies involving either the release or the substantial threat of a release of hazardous substances. Number 2, program-related definitions. Buddy system means a system of organizing employees into work groups in such a manner that each employee of the work group is designated to be observed by at least one other employee in the work group. The purpose of the buddy system is to provide rapid assistance to employees in the event of an emergency. B. Cleanup operation means an operation where hazardous substances are removed, contained, incinerated, neutralized, stabilized, cleared up, or in any other manner processed or handled with the ultimate goal of making the site safer for people or the environment. C. Decontamination means the removal of hazardous substances from employees and their equipment to the extent necessary to preclude the occurrence of foreseeable adverse health effects. Emergency response, or responding to emergency, means a response effort by employees from outside the immediate release area or by other designated responders, i.e. mutual aid groups, local fire departments, etc., to an occurrence which results or is likely to result in an uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance. Responses to incidental releases of hazardous substances, where the substance can be absorbed, neutralized, or otherwise controlled at the time of release by employees in the immediate release area or by maintenance personnel, are not considered to be emergency responses within the scope of this standard. Responses to release of hazardous substances where there is no potential safety or health hazard, i.e. fire explosion or chemical exposure, are not considered to be emergency responses. The minimum items should be addressed. Number 1, pre-emergency planning coordination with outside parties. Number 2, personnel roles of authority, training, and communications. Number 3, emergency recognition and prevention. Number 4, safe distance and places of refuge. E, facility means I, any building or structure, installation, equipment, pipe, or pipeline, including any pipe into a sewer or publicly owned treatment works, well, pit, pond, lagoon, impoundment, ditch, storage container, motor vehicle, rolling stock, or aircraft, or any site or area where a hazardous substance has been deposited, stored, disposed of, placed, or otherwise come to be located, but does not include any consumer product in consumer use or any waterborne vessel. F, hazardous materials response, HazMat team means an organized group of employees designated by the company who are expected to perform work to handle and control actual or potential leaks or spills of hazardous substances, requiring possible close approach to the substance. The team members perform responses to release or potential releases of hazardous substances for the purpose of control or stabilization of the incident. A HazMat team is not a fire brigade, nor is a typical fire brigade a HazMat team. HazMat team, however, may be a separate component of a fire brigade or fire department. G, hazardous substances mean any substance designated or listed below, exposure to which results or may result in adverse effects in one, health or safety of employees. Any substance defined under Section 101.14 of CER-CLA. Any biological agent or other disease-causing agent which after release into the environment and upon exposure, ingestion, inhalation, or assimilation into any person, either directly from the environment or indirectly by ingestion through food chains, will or may reasonably be anticipated to cause death, disease, behavioral abnormalities, cancer, genetic mutation, physiological malfunctions, including malfunctions in reproduction, or physical deformations in such persons or their offspring. Any substance listed by the U.S. Department of Transportation as hazardous material under 49 CFR 172.101 and appendices. Hazardous waste is defined by this program. Hazardous waste shall mean a waste or combination of waste defined in 40 CFR 261.3 or those substances defined as hazardous waste in 49 CFR 171.8. Hazardous waste operation means any operation conducted within the scope of this standard. Hazardous waste site or site means any facility or location within the scope of this standard in which hazardous waste operations take place. Health hazard means a chemical mixture of chemicals or a pathogen for which there is statistically significant evidence based on at least one study conducted in accordance with established scientific principles that acute or chronic health effects may occur in exposed employees. The term health hazard includes chemicals which are carcinogens, toxic or highly toxic agents, reproductive toxins, irritants, corrosives, sensitizers, hepatotoxins, nephrotoxins, and neurotoxins, agents which act on the hematopoietic system, and agents which damage the lungs, skins, eyes, or mucous membranes. It also includes stress due to the temperature extremes. Further definition of the terms used above can be found in Appendix A to 29 CFR 1910.1200. IDLH, or immediately dangerous to life or health, means an atmospheric concentration of any toxic, corrosive, or asphyxiant substance that poses an immediate threat to life or would interfere with an individual's ability to escape from a dangerous atmosphere. Oxygen deficiency means that concentration of oxygen by volume below which atmospheres supplying respiratory protection must be provided. It exists in atmospheres where the percentage of oxygen by volume is less than 19.5% oxygen. Permissible exposure limit means the exposure, inhalation, or dermal permissible exposure limit specified in 29 CFR Part 1910, subparts G and Z. Published exposure level means the exposure limits published in NIOSH Recommendations for Occupational Health Standards dated 1986, which is incorporated by reference as specified in 1910.6. Or if none is specified, the exposure limits published in the standards specified by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists in their publication, Threshold Limit Values and Biological Exposure Indices for 1987-88, dated 1987, which is incorporated by reference as specified in 1910.6. Post-emergency response means that portion of an emergency response performed at the immediate threat of a release has been stabilized or eliminated and cleanup of the site has begun. If post-emergency response is performed by the company's own employees who were part of the initial emergency response, it is considered to be part of the initial response and not post-emergency response. However, if a group or of company employees separate from the group providing initial response performs the cleanup operation, then the separate group of employees would be considered to be performing post-emergency response and be subject to the requirements of this program. Qualified person means a person in which specific training, knowledge, and experience in the area for which the person has responsibility and the authority to control. Site safety and health supervisor means the individual located on a hazardous waste site that is responsible to the company and has the authority, knowledge, and necessary to implement the site safety and health plan and verify compliance with applicable safety and health requirements. Small quantity generator means a generator of hazardous waste who in any calendar year generates no more than 1,000 kilograms, 2,205 pounds of hazardous waste in that month. Uncontrolled hazardous waste site means an area identified as an uncontrolled hazardous waste site by a governmental body, whether federal, state, local, or other, where an accumulation of hazardous substances creates a threat to the health and safety of individuals or the environment, or both. Some sites are found on public land, such as those created by formal municipal, county, or state landfills, where illegal or poorly managed waste disposal has taken place. Other sites are found on private property, often belonging to generators or former generators of hazardous substances. Waste. Examples of such sites include, but are not limited to, surface impounds, landfills, dumps, and take and drum farms. Normal operations at sites are not covered by this definition. HazWaste program for the safety and health of employees. Plaas Incorporated has developed and implemented this written safety and health program for their employees involved in hazardous waste operations. This program is established for the purpose of evaluation, identification, and control of safety and health hazards to employees when confronted with hazardous waste, and to establish procedures for emergency response to hazardous waste situations and operations. The written safety and health program includes the organizational structure for response. The plan also establishes requirements for a site-specific comprehensive work plan, site-specific safety and health plan, confirmation that safety and health training program components are provided, a medical surveillance program appropriate to the work situations and potential exposures, the company's standard operating procedures for safety and health, and associations and coordination procedures as required between the company's safety and health programs and the site-specific work and/or site situations. E. Evacuation safety. Evacuations, trenches, and ground digs performed during preparation of the job site or during hazardous waste operations shall be in accordance with the company's written excavation safety program. This shall ensure that proper shoring and sloping shall be performed as needed to protect employees and to prevent accidental cave-in or collapse. F. Safety requirements for contractors and subcontractors. When the company utilizes a contractor or subcontractor to perform work at a hazardous waste job site or to perform hazardous waste operations such as company personnel, shall be told in advance of site emergency response procedures and any known hazards or potential hazards that could result in fire, explosion, health, safety, or other such exposures. G. The company's written safety and health program and any site-specific programs, work plans, or support information relating to the work shall be made available to any such contractor or subcontractor. This information also shall be made available to employees or their designated representatives and to OSHA, other governmental personnel with regulatory authority over the job site or work operations. Number 4, site program organizational structure. A. This program shall be administered in accordance with the following specific chain of command as well as the following designation of the program responsibility to supervisors and employees. 1. The site superintendent has the responsibility and authority to direct all hazardous waste operations. 2. The safety coordinator or designated site safety representative has the responsibility and authority to develop and implement the site safety and health plan and verify compliance. 3. Other employees and non-company personnel shall be assigned specific responsibilities and tasks to be performed as part of hazardous waste site and emergency response operations. The site-specific organizational structure shall be reviewed and updated as required to ensure that waste site work and safety plans are kept current. C. This program's comprehensive work will explain tasks and objectives as well as resources required to complete the project in accordance with the goals and objectives. The work plan will specifically list and explain planned cleanup activities and the company's standard operating procedures for performance of this kind of work. This includes defining specific tasks and objectives and how these tasks and objectives will be accomplished. The work plan will explain personnel needs as anticipated through project planning and establish procedures and processes for training as required performing tasks, safety, and in accordance with regulatory requirements. This includes providing information, programs as required for the work. The work plan shall also establish and implement a medical surveillance program as required for the work being performed. Site-specific safety and health plan. A. The company has developed and implemented a written safety and health program for employees involved in hazardous waste operations that shall be available for inspection by employees, their representatives, and OSHA personnel. B. The program is designed to identify, evaluate, and control safety and health hazards in their facilities for the purpose of employee protection, to provide for emergency response, meeting company and regulatory requirements, and address as appropriate site analysis, engineering controls, maximum exposure limits, hazardous waste handling procedures, and use of new technologies. C. The site safety and health plan shall be maintained on the job site. It shall identify and establish procedures for protecting employees from safety and health hazards, identified at each phase of the operation. D. The company's written hazard communication program shall be utilized to meet the requirements of 29 CFR 1910.1200 and 29 CFR 1926.59 as part of the company's overall safety and health program implementation. E. The company's site-specific safety and health plan will include the following components as well as others when required by the work. 1. Hazard analysis for each site task and operation contained in the work plan. 2. Employee training assignments in accordance with program and regulatory requirements. 3. Designation of personnel protective equipment required for use by employees based on job hazard analysis for specific tasks and operations. 4. Information about frequency and types of air monitoring, personal monitoring, as well as environmental sampling techniques and instrumentation that will be utilized. This shall include methods of maintenance and protocols for the calibration of monitoring and sampling equipment. 5. Site equipment control measures as explained in the project site control program. 6. Requirements and procedures for decontamination. 7. Emergency response plan and procedures including specific personnel protective equipment and other equipment anticipated to be needed for emergencies. 8. Safety procedures for entering any confined spaces as authorized by the site superintendent. Any confined space entry shall be performed in accordance with the company's confined space entry program. 9. The site-specific plan and program components for spill containment at the job site. 10. A pre-entry briefing shall be held prior to initiating any site activity and at other times as necessary to ensure that employees are kept informed about site safety and health plan components. This information shall be updated and communicated as needed to keep employees aware of current situations. 11. Inspections shall be conducted by the safety coordinator or the designated site safety representative or site superintendent. The company may also utilize qualified third parties to conduct these and other confirmation inspections. Any hazards, unsafe situations, or safety deficiencies discovered by inspection shall be reported to the site superintendent and corrected. Protocols and procedures for site characterization and analysis. Hazardous waste sites shall be evaluated to identify specific site hazards and to determine the appropriate safety and health control procedures needed to protect employees from the identified hazards. This shall be done in accordance with the following methods. 1. Preliminary evaluation. A preliminary evaluation of the site's characteristics shall be performed prior to site entry. This will be done by a qualified person in order to aid in the selection of appropriate employee protection methods prior to site entry. Immediately after initial site entry, a more detailed evaluation shall be performed by a qualified person in order to further identify existing site hazards and to further aid in the selection of appropriate engineering controls and personnel protective equipment for the task to be performed. 2. Hazard identification. All suspected conditions that may pose an inhalation or skin absorption hazards that are immediately dangerous to life or health, IDLH, or other conditions that may cause death or serious harm shall be identified during the preliminary survey and evaluated during the detailed survey. Examples of such hazards include, but are not limited to, 1. Confined space entry, 2. Potentially explosive or flammable situations, 3. Visible vapor clouds, or 4. Areas where biological indicators such as dead animals or vegetation are located. 3. To the extent that is available, the following required information shall be obtained by the company prior to allowing employees to enter a site. 1. Location and approximate site, size of the site. 2. Description of the response activity and or job task to be performed. 3. Duration of the planned employee activity. 4. Site topography and accessibility by air and roads. 5. Safety and health hazards expected at the site. 6. Pathways for hazardous substance dispersion. 7. Present status and capabilities of emergency response teams that would provide assistance to on-site employees at the time of an emergency. 8. Hazardous substance and health hazards involved or expected at the site and their chemical and physical properties. 4. Personnel protective equipment, PPE, shall be provided and used during initial site entry in accordance with the following requirements. 1. PPE shall be selected and used during initial site entry, which will provide protection to and a level of exposure below permissible exposure limits and published exposure levels for known or suspected hazardous substances and health hazards, and which will provide protection against other known and suspected hazards identified during the preliminary site evaluation. 2. If there is no permissible exposure limit or published exposure level, the company may use other published studies and information such as a guide to appropriate personnel protective equipment. If positive pressure self-contained breathing apparatus is not used as part of the entry ensemble, and if respiratory protection is warranted by a potential hazard identified during the preliminary site evaluation, an escape self-contained breathing apparatus of at least 5 minutes duration shall be carried by employees during initial site entry. If the preliminary site evaluation does not produce sufficient information to identify the hazards or suspected hazards of the site, an ensemble provided equivalent to level B PPE shall be provided as a minimum protection, and direct reading instruments shall be used as appropriate for identifying IDLH conditions. Once the hazards of the site have been identified, the appropriate PPE shall be selected and used by employees and non-company personnel at the site. 6. Monitoring shall be conducted during initial site entry when the site evaluation procedures information which shows the potential for ionizing radiation or IDLH conditions, or when the site information is not sufficient reasonably to eliminate these possible conditions. 1. Monitoring with direct reading instruments for hazardous levels of ionizing radiation. 2. Monitoring the air with appropriate direct reading test equipment for i.e. combustible gas meters, detector tubes, for IDLH and other conditions that may cause death or serious harm, combustible or explosive atmospheres, oxygen deficiency, toxic substances. 3. Visually observing for signs or actual or potential IDLH or other dangerous conditions. 7. An ongoing air monitoring program shall be implemented after site characterization has determined the site is safe for the startup of operations. A. Once the presence and concentration of specific hazardous substances and health hazards have been established, the risks associated with these substances shall be identified. Employees who will be working at the site shall be informed of any risks that have been identified. In most situations, this is done in accordance with the company's hazard communication program and required hazard communication training. B, employees shall be notified about any information concerning the chemical, physical, and toxicological properties of each substance known or expected to be present on site that is available to the company or company supervisors at the time. Number 7, project site control considerations and requirements. A, appropriate site control procedures shall be implemented to control employee exposure to hazardous substances before cleanup work begins. B, a site control program for protecting employees shall be developed during the planning stages of a hazardous waste cleanup operation and modified as necessary as new information becomes available. C, the site control program as a minimum include a site map, site work zones, the use of a buddy system, site communications including alerting means for emergencies, the standard operating procedures of safe work practices, and identification of the nearest medical assistance. 8, training. A, all employees working on the site who are exposed to hazardous substances, health hazards, or safety hazards shall receive required training prior to commencing hazardous waste operations that could expose them to hazardous substances, safety, or health hazards. Site supervisors and management responsible for the site, as well as equipment operators, general laborers, and others, shall receive required training for their designated roles and responsibilities prior to the beginning of work. B, employees shall not be permitted to participate in or supervise field activities until they have been trained to a level required by their job function and responsibility. C, training for site employees and personnel shall communicate and explain as required. Names of personnel and alternates responsible for site safety and health and other hazards present on the site, use of personal protective equipment, work practices by which an employee can minimize risk from hazards, safe use of engineering controls and equipment on the site, medical surveillance requirements including recognition of symptoms and signs which might indicate overexposure to hazards, and components of the site safety and health plan required by this program. D, initial training for general site workers engaged in hazardous substance removal or other activities which expose or potentially expose workers to hazardous substance and health hazards shall include a minimum of 40 hours of off-site instruction. Additionally, they shall receive a minimum 3 days actual field experience conducted under the direct supervision of a trained and experienced supervisor. This training will be provided to employees and site personnel, including equipment operators, general laborers, safety, and supervisor personnel. E, site workers who work only occasionally perform a specific limited task, such as but not limited to groundwater monitoring, land surveying, or geophysical surveying, and who are unlikely to be exposed over permissible exposure limits and published exposure limits, shall receive a minimum 24 hours of off-site instruction and a minimum of 1 day actual field experience under the direct supervision of a trained and experienced supervisor. F, site workers who regularly perform tasks in areas which have been monitored and fully characterized, indicating that exposures are under permissible exposure limits and published exposure limits where respirators are not necessary, and the characterization indicates that there is no health hazards or the possibility of an emergency developing, shall receive a minimum of 24 hours of instruction off the site and a minimum of 1 day actual field experience under the direct supervision of a trained and experienced supervisor. G, workers with 24 hours of training who perform as general site workers who are required to wear respirators shall have an additional 16 hours and 2 days of training as necessary to fulfill the total training as required in this program. H, on-site management and supervisors directly responsible for or who supervise employees engaged in hazardous waste operation shall receive 40 hours initial and 3 days of supervised field experience. This training may be reduced to 24 hours and 1 day if the only area of their responsibility is workers on site who only occasionally perform a specific limited task, such as but not limited to groundwater monitoring, land surveying, and or geophysical surveying, and who are unlikely to be exposed over permissible exposure limits and published exposure limits. The same requirement applies to supervision of workers regularly on site who work in areas which have been monitored and fully characterized, indicating that exposures are under permissible exposure limits and published exposure limits where respirators are not necessary, and the characterization indicates that there are no health hazards or the possibility of an emergency developing. I, on-site management and supervisors also shall receive an additional 8 hours of specialized training at the time of job assignment, such as topics but not limited to the company's safety and health program, personal protective equipment program, spill containment program, and health hazard monitoring procedure and techniques. J, trainers shall be qualified to instruct employees about the subject matter that is being presented in training. This includes satisfactory completion of the training program for teaching the subjects that are expected to teach, or they shall have the academic credentials and instructional experience necessary for teaching the subjects. Instructors shall demonstrate competent instructional skills and knowledge of the applicable subject matter. K. Employees and supervisors that have received and successfully completed the required training and field experience shall be certified by their instructor or the head instructor and trained supervisor as having completed the necessary training. A written certificate shall be given to each person so certified. Any person who has not been so certified or who does not meet requirements shall be prohibited from engaging in hazardous waste operations. Employees who are engaged in responding to hazardous emergency situations at hazardous waste cleanup sites that may expose them to hazardous substances shall be trained in how to respond to such expected emergencies. M. Employees working at the site, managers and supervisors, shall receive 8 hours of refresher training annually in accordance with the company and regulatory requirements. N. Training for emergency response employees shall be completed before they are called upon to perform in real emergencies. Such training shall include the elements of the emergency response plan, standard operating procedures the company has established for the job, the personnel protective equipment to be worn, and procedures for handling emergency incidents. O. Exception number 1. The company does not train all employees to the degree specified if the company divides the workforce in a manner that such a sufficient number of employees who have responsibility to control emergencies have the training specified, and all other employees who may first respond to an emergency incident have sufficient awareness training to recognize that an emergency response situation exists, and that they are instructed in that case to summon the fully trained employees and not attempt control activities for which they are not trained. P. Exception number 2. The company need not train all employees to the degree specified if arrangements have been made in advance for an outside fully trained emergency response team to respond in a reasonable period, and all employees who may come into the incident first have sufficient awareness training to recognize that an emergency response situation exists, and they have been instructed to call the designated outside fully trained emergency response team for assistance. Q. Employee members of facility emergency response organizations shall be trained to a level of competence in the recognition of health and safety hazards to protect themselves and other employees. This would include training in the methods used to minimize the risk from safety and health hazards, in the safe use and control of equipment, in the selection and use of appropriate personnel protective equipment, in the safe operating procedures to be used at the incident scene, in the techniques of coordination with other employees to minimize risks, the appropriate person to overexposure from health hazards or injury to themselves or other employees, and in recognition of subsequent symptoms which may result from overexposures. R. Training shall be based on the duties and function to be performed by each responder of an emergency response organization. The skill and knowledge levels required for all new responders, those hired, and the effective date of this standard shall be conveyed to them through training before they are permitted to take part in an actual emergency operations of an incident. Employees who participate or are expected to participate in emergency response shall be given training in accordance with the following. 1. First responder awareness level. First responders at the awareness level are individuals who are likely to witness or discover a hazardous substance release or who have been trained to initiate the emergency response sequence by notifying the proper authorities of the release. They would take no further action beyond notifying the authorities of the release. First responders of the awareness level shall have sufficient training or have had sufficient experience to objectively demonstrate competency in the following areas. 1. An understanding of what hazardous substances are and the risks associated with them in an incident. 2. An understanding of the potential outcomes associated with an emergency created when hazardous substances are present. 3. The ability to recognize the presence of hazardous substances in an emergency. 4. The ability to identify the hazardous substances if possible. 5. An understanding of the role of the first responder awareness individual in the company's emergency response plan, including site security and control of the U.S. Department of Transportation's emergency response guidebook. 6. The ability to realize the need for additional resources and to make appropriate notifications to the communication center. 2. First responder operations level. First responders at the operations level are individuals who respond to release or potential releases of hazardous substances as part of the initial response to the site for the purpose of protecting nearby persons, property, or the environment from the effects of the release. They are trained to respond in a defensive fashion without actually trying to stop the release. Their function is to contain the release from a safe distance, keeping it from spreading and prevent exposures. First responders at the operational level shall have received at least 8 hours of training or have had sufficient experience to objectively demonstrate competency in the following areas, in addition to those listed awareness level, and the company shall so certify. Number 1, knowledge of the basic hazard and risk assessment techniques. 2, know how to select and use personnel protective equipment provided to the first responder operational level. 3, an understanding of the basic hazardous material terms. 4, know how to perform basic control, containment, and or confinement operations within the capabilities of the resources and personnel protective equipment available with their unit. 5, know how to implement basic decontamination procedures. 6, an understanding of relevant standard operating procedures and termination procedures. 3, hazardous materials technician. Hazardous materials technicians are individuals who respond to releases or potential releases for the purpose of stopping the release. They assume a more aggressive role than the first responder at the operations level in that they will approach the point of release in order to plug, patch, or otherwise stop the release of a hazardous substance. Hazardous material technicians shall have received at least 24 hours of training equal to the first responder operations level, and in addition have competency in the following areas, and the company shall so certify. 1, know how to implement the company's emergency response plan. 2, know the classification, identification, and verification known and unknown materials by using field survey instruments and equipment. 3, be able to function within an assigned role as incident command system. 4, know how to select and use proper specialized chemical protective equipment provided to the hazardous materials technicians. 5, understand hazard and risk assessment techniques. 6, be able to perform advanced control, containment, and or confinement operations within the capabilities of the resources and personnel protective equipment available with the unit. 7, understand and implement decontamination procedures. 8, understand termination procedures. 9, understand basic chemical and toxicological terminology and behavior. 4, hazardous material specialists. Hazardous material specialists are individuals who respond with and or provide support to hazardous material technicians. Their duties parallel those of the hazardous material technician. However, these duties require a more directed or specific knowledge of the various substances that may be called upon to contain. The hazardous material specialist would also act as a site liaison within federal, state, and local and other government authorities in regards to site activities. Hazardous materials specialists shall have received at least 24 hours training equal to the technician level, and in addition have competency in the following areas, and the company shall so certify. Number 1, know how to implement the local emergency response plan. 2, understand classification, identification, and verification of known and unknown materials by using advanced survey instruments and equipment. Number 3, know the state emergency response plan. Number 4, be able to select and use proper specialized chemical personnel protective equipment provided to the hazardous materials specialist. Number 5, understand in-depth hazard and risk techniques. Number 6, be able to perform specialized control, containment, and or confinement operations within the capabilities of the resources and personal protective equipment available. 7, be able to determine and implement decontamination procedures. 8, have the ability to develop a site safety and control plan. 9, understand chemical, radiological, and toxicological terminology and behavior. 5, on-scene incident commander. Incident commanders who will assume control of the incident scene beyond the first responder awareness level shall receive at least 24 hours of training prior equal to the first responder operations level, and in addition to have competency in the following areas, and the company shall so certify. 1, know how to know and be able to implement the company's incident command system. 2, know how to implement the company's emergency response plan. 3, know and understand the hazards and risks associated with employees working in chemical protective clothing. 4, know how to implement the local emergency response plan. 5, know of the state emergency response plan and of the federal regional response team. 6, know and understand the importance of decontamination procedures. 6, trainers. Trainers who teach any of the above training subjects shall have satisfactorily completed a training course for teaching the subjects they are expected to teach, such as the courses offered by the U.S. National Fire Academy, or they shall have the training and or academic credentials and instructional experience necessary to demonstrate competent instructional skills and a good command of the subject matter of the courses they are to teach. Number 9, medical surveillance program requirements. A, employees engaged in site operations requiring medical surveillance shall be protected by establishment, implementation, and maintenance of such a program in accordance with the company and regulatory requirements. B, the medical surveillance program shall be instituted by the company for the following employees. 1, all employees who are or may be exposed to hazardous substances or health hazards at or above the established permissible exposure limit above the published exposure levels for these substances without regard to the use of respirators for 30 days or more a year. 2, all employees who wear a respirator for 30 days or more a year. 3, all employees who are injured, become ill, or develop signs of symptoms due to possible overexposure involving hazardous substances or health hazards from an emergency response or hazardous waste operation, and members of the hazmat teams. C, medical examinations and consultations shall be made available by the company to each covered employee on a schedule appropriate to their work assignment and in accordance with regulatory requirements. In general, this means prior to assignment, at least once every 12 months for each employee covered, unless the attending physician believes a longer interval, not greater than biannually, is appropriate. 3, at termination of employment or reassignment to an area where the employee would not be covered if an employee has not had an examination within the last 6 months. 4, as soon as possible upon notification by an employee that the employee has developed signs or symptoms indicated possible overexposure to hazardous substances or health hazards, or that the employee has been injured or exposed above the permissible exposure limits or published exposure levels in an emergency situation. 5, at more frequent times, if the examining physician determines that an increased frequency of examination is medically necessary. 6, for employees who have been injured, received a health impairment, developed signs or symptoms which may have resulted from exposure to hazardous substances, resulted from an emergency incident, or exposed during an emergency incident to hazardous substances at concentrations above the permissible exposure limits or the published exposure levels without the necessary personnel protective equipment being used. 1, as soon as possible following the emergency incident or development of signs or symptoms. 2, at additional times if the examining physician determines that follow-up examinations or consultations are medically necessary. 7, required medical examinations shall include a medical and work history or updated history if one is in the employee's file, with special emphasis on symptoms related to the handling of hazardous substances and health hazards, and to fitness for duty, including the ability to wear any required PPE under work conditions, i.e. temperature extremes, that may be expected at the work site. 8, the content of medical examinations or consultations made available to employees shall be determined by the attending physician. 9, all medical examinations and procedures shall be performed by the or under the supervision of a licensed physician, preferably one knowledgeable in occupational medicine, and shall be provided without cost to the employee, without loss of pay, and at a reasonable time and place. 10, the company shall provide one copy of 1910.120 Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response and its appendices to the attending physician, and in addition to the following for each employee. 1, a description of the employee's duties as they relate to the employer's exposures. 2, the employer's exposure levels or anticipated exposure levels. 3, a description of any personnel protective equipment used to be used. 4, information from previous medical examinations of the employee which is not readily available to the examining physician. 5, information required by 1910.134. 6, the company shall obtain and furnish the employee with a copy of the written opinion for the examining physician containing the following. 1, the physician's opinion as to whether the employee has detected medical conditions which would place the employee at increased risk from material impairment of the employee's health from work in hazardous waste operations or emergency response, or from respirator use. 2, the physician's recommended limitations upon the employee's assigned work. 3, the results of the medical examination and tests if requested by the employee. 4, a statement that the employee has been informed by the physician of the results of the medical examination and any medical conditions which require further examination or treatment. 5, the written opinion obtained by the company shall not reveal specific findings or diagnosis unrelated to the occupational exposure. 6, an accurate written record of medical surveillance shall be retained by the company for the period specified, and to meet criteria of 29 CFR 1910.20. The required record shall include at least the following information: A, the name and social security number of the employee. B, physician's written opinions, recommended limitations, and results of examinations and tests. C, any employee medical complaints related to exposure to hazardous. D, a copy of the information provided the examining physician of the company, with the exception of the standard and its appendices. A. Engineering controls, work practices, personal protective equipment, and/or a combination of these shall be implemented as required to protect employees from exposure to hazardous substances and safety and health hazards. B. Engineering controls and work practices shall be instituted to reduce or maintain employee exposure or to below the permissible exposure limits for substances regulated by 29 CFR Part 1910 to the extent required by Subpart Z, except to the extent that such controls and practices are not feasible. C. Engineering controls which may be feasible include the use of pressurized cabs or control booths on equipment and/or the use of remotely operated material handling equipment. Work practices which may be feasible are removing all non-essential employees from potential exposure during opening of drums, wetting down dusty operations, and locating employees upwind of possible hazards. D. Whenever engineering controls and work practices are not feasible or not required, any reasonable combination of engineering controls, work practices, and PPE shall be used to reduce and maintain to or below the permissible exposure limits or dose limits for substances regulated by 29 CFR Part 1910 Subpart Z. E. The company shall not implement a schedule of employee rotation as a means of compliance with permissible exposure limits or dose limits except when there is no other feasible way of complying with the airborne or dermal dose limits for ionizing radiation. Number 11, proper selection and use of personal protective equipment, PPE. A. Personal protective equipment, PPE, shall be selected and used, which will protect employees from the hazards and potential hazards they are likely to encounter as identified during the site characterization and analysis. B. Personal protective equipment selection shall be based on an evaluation of the performance characteristics of the PPE relative to the requirements and limitations of the site, the task-specific conditions and duration, and the hazards and potential hazards identified at the site. Positive pressure self-contained breathing apparatus or positive pressure airline respirators equipped with an escape air supply shall be used when chemical exposure levels present will create a substantial possibility of immediate death, immediate serious illness or injury, or impair the ability to escape. Totally encapsulating chemical protective suits, protection equipment to level A protection, shall be used in conditions where skin absorption of the hazardous substance may result in a substantial possibility of immediate death, immediate serious illness or injury, or impair the ability to escape. E. The level of protection provided by PPE selection shall be increased when additional information or site conditions show that increased protection is necessary to reduce employee exposures below permissible exposure limits and publish exposure levels for hazardous substances and health hazards. F. The level of employee protection provided may be decreased when additional information or site conditions show that decreased protection will not result in hazardous exposures to employees. G. Personal protective equipment shall be selected and used to meet the requirements of 29 CFR Part 1910 Subpart 1 and additional requirements specified in the company's safety policies. H. Totally encapsulating suits shall protect employees from the particular hazards which are identified during site characterization and analysis. Totally encapsulating suits shall be capable of maintaining positive air pressure and preventing inward test gas leakage of more than 0.5%. I. The company's personnel protective equipment program will be utilized to satisfy requirements regarding HazWaste operations. As needed, this program shall be supplemented to address elements listed below. When elements such as doning and doffing procedures are provided by the manufacturer of a piece of equipment and are attached to the plan, they need to be rewritten into the plan as long as they adequately address the procedure or element. 1. PPE selection based upon site hazards. 2. PPE use and limitations of the equipment. 3. Work mission duration. 4. PPE maintenance and storage. 5. PPE decontamination and disposal. 6. PPE training and proper fitting. 7. PPE donning and doffing procedures. 8. PPE inspection procedures prior to, during, and after use. 9. Evaluation of effectiveness of the PPE program. And 10. Limitations during temperature extremes, heat stress, and other appropriate medical considerations. Monitoring requirements and procedures. Monitoring shall be performed where there may be a question of employee exposure to hazardous concentration of hazardous substances in order to ensure proper selection of engineering controls, work practices, and personal protective equipment so that employees are not exposed to levels which exceed permissible exposure limits or published exposure levels if there are no permissible exposure limits for hazardous substances. B. Air monitoring shall be used to identify and quantify airborne levels of hazardous substances and safety and health hazards in order to determine that the appropriate level of employee protection needed on site. C. Upon initial entry, representative air monitoring shall be conducted to identify any IDLH condition, exposure over permissible exposure limits, or published exposure levels, exposure over radioactive materials dose limits, or other dangerous conditions such as presence of flammable atmospheres, oxygen-deficient environments. D. Periodic monitoring shall be conducted when the possibility of an IDLH condition or flammable atmosphere has developed or where there is indication that exposures may have risen over permissible exposure limits or published exposure levels since prior monitoring. Situations where it shall be considered whether the possibility that exposures have risen are as follows. 1. When work begins or on a different portion of the site. 2. When contaminants other than those previously identified are being handled. 3. When a different type of operation is initiated, example, drum opening as opposed to exploratory well drilling. 4. When employees are handling leaking drums or containers or working in areas with obvious liquid contamination, example, a spill or lagoon. 5. Following the start of an actual cleanup phase of any hazardous waste operation, for example, when soil, surface, water, or containers are moved or distributed. The company shall monitor employees who are likely to have the highest exposures to any hazardous substances and health hazards that may be present above permissible exposure limits or published exposure levels. 6. This monitoring shall be performed using personal sampling frequently enough to characterize employee exposures. Number 7, the company may utilize a representative sampling approach by documenting that the employees and chemicals chosen for monitoring are based on the criteria stated in item 5, immediately above. If the employees likely to have the highest exposure are over permissible exposure limits or published exposure limits, then monitoring shall continue to determine all employees likely to be above those limits. The company may utilize a representative sampling approach by documenting that the employees and chemicals chosen for monitoring are based on the criteria stated above. 8. The company shall develop and implement a program component to inform employees, contractors, and subcontractors, or their representative, actually engaged in hazardous waste operations of the nature, level, and degree of exposure likely as a result of participation in such hazardous waste operations. 9. Employees, contractors, and subcontractors working outside of the operations part of a site are not covered by this program. Handling drums and containers. A. Hazardous substances, contained liquids, or other residues shall be handled, transported, labeled, and disposed of in accordance with established company safety procedures. B. Drums and containers used during the cleanup shall meet the appropriate DOT, OSHA, and EPA regulations for the waste that they contain. C. When practical, drums and containers shall be inspected and their integrity shall be assured prior to being moved. Drums or containers that cannot be inspected before being moved because of storage conditions, i.e. buried beneath the earth, stacked behind other drums, stacked several tiers high in a pile, shall be moved to an accessible location and inspected prior to further handling. D. Unlabeled drums and containers shall be considered to contain hazardous substances and handled accordingly until the contents are positively identified and labeled. E. Site operations shall be organized to minimize the amount of drum or container movement. F. Before drums or containers are moved, all employees exposed to the transfer operation shall be warned of the potential hazards associated with the contents of the drums or containers. G. U.S. Department of Transportation specified salvage drums or containers and suitable quantities of proper absorbent shall be kept available and used in areas where spills, leaks, or ruptures may occur. H. Where major spills may occur, a spill containment program shall be implemented by the company to contain and isolate the entire volume of hazardous substance being transferred. I. Drums and containers that cannot be moved without rupture, leakage, or spillage shall be emptied into a sound container using a device classified for the material being transferred. J. A ground-penetrating system or other type detection system or device shall be used to estimate the location and depth of buried drums or containers. K. Soil or covering material shall be removed with caution to prevent drum or container rupture. L. Appropriate fire extinguishing equipment shall be on hand and ready for use to control incipient fires. M. The following procedures shall be followed in areas where drums or containers are being opened. 1. Where an airline respirator system is used, connections to the source of air supply shall be protected from contamination and the entire system shall be protected from physical damage. 2. Employees not actually involved in opening drums or containers shall be kept a safe distance from the drums or containers being opened. 3. If employees must work near or adjacent to drums or containers being opened, a suitable shield that does not interfere with the work operation shall be placed between the employee and the drums or containers being opened to protect the employee in case of accidental explosion. 4. Controls for drum or container opening equipment, monitoring equipment, and fire suppression equipment shall be located behind the explosion-resistant barrier. 5. When there is a reasonable possibility of flammable atmospheres being present, material handling equipment and hand tools shall be of the type to prevent sources of ignition. 6. Drums and containers shall be opened in such a manner that excess interior pressure will be safely relieved. If pressure cannot be relieved from a remote location, appropriate shielding shall be placed between the employee and the drums or containers to reduce the risk of employee injury. 7. Employees shall not stand upon or work from drums or containers. 8. Material handling equipment used to transfer drums and containers shall be selected, positioned, and operated to minimize sources of ignition related to the equipment from igniting vapors released from ruptured drums or containers. 9. Drums and containers containing radioactive waste shall not be handled until such time as their hazard to employees is properly assessed. 10. Drums and containers containing or suspected of containing shock-sensitive wastes shall be handled in accordance to the following special precautions. 1. All non-essential employees shall be evacuated from the area or transferred. 2. Material handling equipment shall be provided with explosive containment devices or protective shields to protect equipment operators from exploding containers. 3. An employee alarm system capable of being perceived above surrounding light and noise conditions shall be used to signal the commencement and completion of explosive waste handling activities. 4. Continuous communications, i.e. portable radios, hand signals, telephones, as appropriate, shall be maintained between the employee in charge of the immediate handling area and both the site safety and health supervisor and the command post until such a time as the handling operation is completed. Communication equipment or methods that could cause shock-sensitive materials to explode shall not be used. 5. Drums or containers under pressure as evidenced by bulging or swelling shall not be moved until such time as the cause for excess pressure is determined and appropriate containment procedures have been implemented to protect employees from explosive relief of the drum. 6. Drums and containers containing packaged laboratory waste shall be considered to contain shock-sensitive or explosive materials until they have been characterized as caution. Shipping of shock-sensitive waste may be prohibited under U.S. Department of Transportation regulations. Refer to 49 CFR 173.21 and 173.50. Number 7. In addition to other requirements of this program, the following precautions shall be taken as a minimum in handling laboratory waste packs, lab packs. Lab packs shall be opened only when necessary and then only by an individual knowledgeable in the inspection, classification, and segregation of the containers within the pack according to the hazards of the waste. 9. If crystalline material is noted on any container, the contents shall be handled as a shock-sensitive waste until the contents are identified. Sampling of containers and drums shall be done in accordance with a sampling procedure, which is part of the Site Safety and Health Plan developed for and available to employees and others at the specific worksite. 7. Drums and containers shall be identified and classified prior to packaging for shipment. 8. Drum or container staging areas shall be kept to the minimum number necessary to safely identify and classify materials and prepare them for transport. 9. Staging areas shall be provided with adequate access and egress routes. 10. The bulking of hazardous waste shall be permitted only after a thorough characterization of the materials has been completed. 11. Tanks and vaults containing hazardous substances shall be handled in a manner similar to that of drums and containers, taking into consideration the size of the tank or vault. Appropriate tank or vault entry procedures as described in the company's safety and health plan shall be followed whenever employees must enter a tank or vault. 9. Employees and procedures for decontamination. A. Procedures for all phases of decontamination shall be developed and implemented by the company for each hazardous waste work location. B. Decontamination procedures for the job site shall be communicated to employees and implemented before personnel or equipment enters areas where there is potential for exposure to hazardous substances. C. Site-specific standard operating procedures shall be developed and utilized to minimize employee contact with hazardous substances or with equipment that has contacted hazardous substances. D. All employees and personnel leaving a contaminated area shall be decontaminated in accordance with company and regulatory safety and health requirements. All contaminated clothing and equipment leaving a contaminated area shall be appropriately disposed of or decontaminated. E. Decontamination procedures shall be monitored by the designated site safety representative and/or site superintendent with ongoing review by the safety coordinator. This monitoring is intended to determine effectiveness of decontamination procedures and practices. When such procedures or practices are found to be ineffective, appropriate steps shall be taken to correct any deficiencies. F. Decontamination operations shall be performed in one or more areas that have been selected to minimize the exposure of uncontaminated employees or equipment to contaminated employees or equipment. G. All equipment or solvents used for decontamination shall be decontaminated or disposed of properly. H. Protective clothing and equipment shall be decontaminated, cleaned, laundered, and maintained or replaced as needed to maintain their effectiveness. I. Employees whose non-impermeable clothing becomes wetted with hazardous substances shall immediately remove that clothing and proceed to shower. The clothing shall be disposed of or decontaminated before it is removed from the work zone. J. Unauthorized employees shall not remove protective clothing or equipment from change rooms. K. Commercial laundries or cleaning establishments that decontaminate protective clothing or equipment shall be informed of the potentially harmful effects of exposure to hazardous substances. L. Where the decontamination procedure indicates a need for regular showers and change rooms outside of a contaminated area, they shall be provided and meet the requirements of 29 CFR 1910.141. If temperature conditions prevent the effective use of water, then other effective means for cleansing shall be provided and used. 12. Emergency response by employees at uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. A. An emergency response plan shall be developed and implemented by the company as required by governmental regulations to handle anticipated emergencies. This plan shall be prepared prior to the commencement of hazardous waste operations. The plan shall be in writing and available for inspection and copying by employees or representatives, OSHA personnel, and other governmental agencies with relevant responsibilities. B. Employers who will evacuate their employees from a danger area where an emergency occurs and who do not permit any of their employees to assist in handling the emergency are exempt from the requirements of this paragraph if they provide. C. The site-specific emergency response plan for emergencies shall address as a minimum the following. 1. Pre-emergency planning. 2. Personnel roles, line of authority, training, and communication. 3. Emergency recognition and prevention. 4. Safe distances and places of refuge. 5. Site security and control. 6. Evacuation routes and procedures. 7. Decontamination procedures not covered by the Site Safety and Health Plan. 8. Emergency medical treatment and first aid. 9. An emergency. 10. Emergency alerting and response procedures. 11. Critique of response and follow-up. 12. PPE and emergency equipment. D. Action plan complying with 29 CFR 1910.38. E. In addition to the elements for the emergency response plan, the following elements for handling emergency incidents shall be included for emergency response plans. 1. Site topography, layout, and prevailing weather conditions. 2. Procedures for reporting incidents to local, state, and federal governmental agencies. F. The emergency response plan shall be a separate section of the Site Safety and Health Plan. G. The emergency response plan shall be compatible and integrated with the disaster, fire, and emergency response plans of local, state, and federal agencies. H. The emergency response plan shall be rehearsed regularly as part of the overall training program for site operations. I. The site emergency response plan shall be reviewed periodically as necessary, be amended to keep it current with new or changing site conditions or information. J. An employee alarm system shall be installed in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.165 to notify employees of an emergency situation, to stop work activities if necessary, to lower background noise in order to speed communication, and to begin emergency procedures. K. Based upon the information available at the time of the emergency, site management and safety personnel shall evaluate the incident and the site response capabilities and proceed with the appropriate steps to implement the site emergency response plan. Areas accessible to employees shall be lighted to not less than minimum illumination intensities listed in Table H-120.1 in 1910.120M while any work is in progress. 13. Sanitation at temporary workplace. A. An adequate supply of portable water shall be provided on the site. B. Portable containers used to dispense drinking water shall be capable of being tightly closed and equipped with a tap. Water shall not be dipped from containers. C. Any container used to distribute drinking water shall be clearly marked as to the nature of its contents and not used for any other purpose. D. Where single-service cups to be used but once are supplied, both a sanitary container for the unused cups and a receptacle for disposing of the used cups shall be provided. E. Outlets for non-portable Potable water, such as water for firefighting purposes, shall be identified to indicate clearly that the water is unsafe and is not to be used for drinking, washing, or cooking purposes. F. There shall be no cross-connection, open or potential, between a system furnishing potable water and a system furnishing non-potable water. G. Toilets shall be provided for employees according to Table H.120.2 and 1910.120N3. H. Under temporary field conditions, provisions shall be made to assure not less than one toilet facility is available. I. Hazardous waste sites not provided with a sanitary sewer shall be provided with the following toilet facilities unless prohibited by local codes. 1. Chemical toilets. 2. Recirculation toilets. 3. Combustion toilets. Or 4. Flush toilets. J. These requirements for sanitation facilities shall not apply to mobile crews having transportation readily available to nearby toilet facilities. K. Doors entering toilet facilities shall be provided with entrance locks controlled from inside the facility. L. All food service facilities and operations for employees shall meet the applicable laws, ordinances, and regulations of the jurisdictions in which they are located. M. When temporary sleeping quarters are provided, they shall be heated, ventilated, and lighted. N. The company shall provide adequate washing facilities for employees engaged in operations where hazardous substances may be harmful to employees. Such facilities shall be in near proximity to the work site in areas where exposures are below permissible exposure limits and which are under the controls of the company, and shall be equipped as to enable employees to remove hazardous substances from themselves. O. When hazardous waste cleanup or removal operations commence on a site and the duration of the work will require 6 months or greater time to complete, the company shall provide showers and change rooms for all employees exposed to hazardous substances and health hazards involved in hazardous waste cleanup or removal operations. P. Showers shall be provided and meet the requirements of 29 CFR 1910.141. Q. Change room shall be provided and shall meet the requirements of 29 CFR 1910.141. Change room shall consist of 2 separate change areas separated by the required shower area. 1 change area with an exit leading off the work site shall provide employees with an area where they can put on, remove, and store work clothing and personal protective equipment. R. Showers and change rooms shall be located in areas where exposures are below the permissible exposure limits and published exposure levels. If this cannot be accomplished, then a ventilation system shall be provided that will supply the air that is below the permissible exposure limits and published exposure levels. S. The company shall assure that employees shower at the end of their work shift and when leaving the hazardous waste site. New technology programs. The company shall develop and implement procedures for the introduction of effective new technologies and equipment developed for the improved protection of employees working with hazardous waste cleanup operation, and the same shall be implemented as part of the Site Safety and Health Program to assure that employee protection is being maintained. New technologies, equipment, or control measures available to the industry, such as the use of foams, absorbents, neutralizers, or other means to suppress the level of air contaminants while excavating the site for spill control, shall be evaluated by the company or its representatives. Such an evaluation shall be done to determine the effectiveness of the new methods, materials, or equipment before implementing their use on a large scale for enhancing employee protection. Information and data from manufacturers or suppliers may be used as part of the company's evaluation effort. Such evaluation shall be made available to OSHA upon request. Senior official. The senior official at an emergency response is the most senior official on the site who has the responsibility for controlling operations at the site.